I'm Ethan, and I was 13 when my quiet life in the suburbs of Chicago took a turn into what felt like a horror movie plot. It's a story I've replayed in my mind countless times, each detail etched into my memory with startling clarity. My parents were the kind to plan weekend getaways to break the monotony of our daily routines. The weekend, it all happened. They were excited about touring Napa Valley vineyards, a trip they'd been looking forward to for months. Their departure left me with a mix of freedom and an unspoken responsibility that I was eager to prove I could handle. During this time, my life online was flourishing in ways my real life simply wasn't. World of Warcraft was my realm of choice, a place where I was more than just an awkward teen. It was there I met Jasmine, or at least, the person I believed was Jasmine. Our chat started with in-game tactics, but soon ventured into personal territory. "You really get it, Ethan," one message read. "It's like you're reading my mind." These exchanges were my nightly highlight, a digital connection that felt genuinely real. The decision to invite Jasmine over was born out of a half-joking conversation that suddenly seemed possible with my parents away. It's even unusual that she lived so close to me, just a few tens of kilometers. Imagine battling side by side, but in the real life, she'd typed. The thrill of meeting her was intoxicating, so I shared my address and we agreed on a late-night rendezvous to keep it our little secret. At that moment, we already were flirting for several weeks at least. Obviously, we felt attracted to each other. It was Friday. My parents left at 8 p.m. Our house was a 2-story, somewhat creaky place that felt too big when I was alone. Its wooden floors had a way of amplifying sounds, making the quiet of the night seem louder. As the evening of Jasmine's visit approached, I tidied up, imagining how I'd introduce her to my world beyond the screen. She was late. But as dusk settled, Jasmine's messages grew odd. "I will make you remember this night, even if you will resist it," one read, a departure from her usual playful tone. Something sinister was here. Why did she text it in this way? I tried to shake off the uneasiness creeping up on me, attributing it to pre-meeting jitters. When 11:45 p.m. passed without any sign of her, I felt a mix of disappointment and concern. She just disappeared, and from 9:10 p.m., didn't respond to my messages at all. I just remember that later, a little after midnight, I heard some strange sounds from the first floor that decided it was our cat that returned from one more late walk, so I was keep playing video games and ignored it. I tried to take my mind off this world. Jasmine still wasn't answering me. I was already about to go to bed, but then at 1:07 a.m., a message arrived that sent a chill through me. "Don't fall asleep, Ethan. Don't leave me alone here." What did it mean? I tried to find an answer, but I only felt that the atmosphere around me was becoming oppressive. How did she know that I was about to go to bed? Honestly, at that moment, I felt real fear. But in several minutes, I got one more message. "I'm closer than you think." I always left the door to my room open because my mother asked me to do so, but now I jumped up and locked it, then turned on all the lights in my room. It was unsettling, not at all like the Jasmine I thought I knew. The messages that followed in just several minutes were cryptic, playing on my growing fear. "Look outside, Ethan. I'm waiting." That's when it hit me. What if the person behind these messages wasn't Jasmine? Panic set in, and instinctively I look around room looking for something to defend myself. Peering from my window, I saw him. A figure, cloaked in shadows, standing eerily still in my backyard. His stance was unnerving, predatory even, as if he was savoring the fear his presence instilled. The dim light from the garden lamps cast a ghastly glow, giving him an almost spectral appearance. I realized that he was holding something oblong in his hand. Was it a knife? I stepped out from the window when realized that this man is also looking at me. The first thing I did was dial my parents with my heart beating so fast. It was difficult to breathe, but the call went straight to voicemail. My next call was to 911. My voice barely a whisper as I described the intruder lurking in the darkness. The wait for the police was agonizing, every second stretching into an eternity. The house, once my safe haven, now felt like a trap. The wooden floors that I had always found comforting now seemed to mock me with their creaks and groans. When the police finally arrived, they found evidence of a break-in not just outside but inside the house. The thought that this person, this imposter, had been inside my home, possibly while I was playing a video game turning my back to the open door, was horrifying. Also, a few days later, my parents, who returned right that night after a call from the police, discovered that one of the kitchen knives was missing. We never found it. By the way, the person who was in the garden simply had disappeared. As far as I know, the police still have not found out who it was. Of course, since that night I have not communicated with the one I called Jasmine. That night changed me. It was a brutal introduction to the darker side of the digital world, a lesson in the dangers of trusting an online persona. The breach of my home's sanctity, the invasion of my personal space, left me with a lingering sense of vulnerability that no amount of time has completely erased. In sharing this story, I hope to highlight the importance of caution in our online interactions. The world behind the screen can be as dangerous as the one outside, a reality I learned in the most terrifying way. My name is Jenna, and living alone had always been a point of pride for me. My quaint old house, nestled on the outskirts of a sleepy town and bordered by a thick, whispering forest, was my sanctuary. It was a place where I could hear my own thoughts, where the hustle of the outside world faded into the background. But one eerie night, my cherished solitude was shattered, transforming my haven into the setting of a chilling ordeal. That time I was 26 years old. The unease started with subtle, almost dismissible occurrences. Objects around the house, a vase, a picture frame, a book, seemed to move from their designated spots. I initially laughed it off, attributing these anomalies to my own absent-mindedness. However, a nagging feeling at the back of my mind whispered that something wasn't quite right. This feeling grew stronger as the days passed, casting a shadow over the comfort I once felt within my own home. Then came that fateful night, a night when the moon hung low and full, casting eerie shadows through the branches of the encroaching forest. As I prepared for bed, the house felt unusually oppressive, as if charged with a silent, expectant energy. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the remnants of a long day weighing on me. But as I lay in bed, the silence of the house was broken by an unsettling sound, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard, the kind that comes from deliberate, cautious footsteps. My heart raced and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. The sound was coming from downstairs, a stealthy, sinister intrusion into my private world. Paralyzed with fear, I strained my ears, hoping to convince myself I'd imagined the sound. But then it came again. Closer this time, more pronounced. It was the undeniable presence of someone else in the house. In a moment of panic, I reached for my phone, only to realize it was charging downstairs, in the very heart of my vulnerability. I was contemplating my next move when a dark figure appeared in the doorway of my bedroom. It was a man, his features obscured by the shadows, but the intent in his stance was unmistakably sinister. A surge of adrenaline propelled me into action, and I screamed, a sound that seemed to startle him as much as it did me. He began to speak, his voice a menacing whisper that slithered through the darkness. "You shouldn't be alone out here," he hissed, a statement that was both a threat and a twisted form of advice. His words were chilling, not just for their content, but for the calm, almost curious tone in which they were delivered. Just as I felt the situation could get no worse, salvation came in the most unexpected form, a loud, authoritative knock at the front door. The intruder tensed, his head snapping towards the sound. The knock came again, firmer this time, followed by the clear voice of the local sheriff calling out, "Hey, are you all right? Is everything okay in there? Open the door." The intruder hesitated, his dark silhouette framed against the moonlit window. Then he turned and fled through the door he'd entered, disappearing into the night from which he'd come. Shaken, I rushed downstairs, flinging the door open to the reassuring sight of the sheriff, his flashlight piercing the darkness around us. He explained that a patient from the nearby mental health facility had escaped a few days ago. The patient was known to be delusional, often harboring fantasies of invading homes to save those he perceived as vulnerable. The sheriff had been making rounds in the area, checking on residents, especially those living in more secluded locations like mine. He heard me screaming and ran to my house to find out the reason of the noise. I told him what happened, and he immediately ran out of the house to try to catch the psychopath, but found no one. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, the sheriff returned and said that the escapee's name was Joseph Ringles. 18 years ago, he strangled his sister in her sleep for no reason because he was trying to save her from the voices in his head. Over the past 2 days, the sheriff has found many strangled, stray dogs and cats, and he is sure that this is the work of Joseph. He promised to find him as soon as possible. In the aftermath, as the sheriff's car disappeared down the road, I was left in a home that felt like a shell of its former self. The intrusion had stripped away the sense of security I'd taken for granted, leaving behind a lingering fear and a slew of unanswered questions. How long had this psychopath been watching me? What might have happened had the sheriff not arrived when he did? I am afraid to think about it. I just try to forget that night, but still can't. For your understanding, I am 41 now and I still sleep with a nightlight. I live with 2 Dobermans and I always double-check all the doors and windows before going to bed, even given the fact that I changed my place only a couple of days after that incident. The sheriff died of some kind of lung disease several years ago, and Joseph has still not been found. I have always prided myself on being rational, even back in 2014 at the age of 16. But there was this one night while I was home alone that tested every ounce of my skepticism. It was a night that transformed the familiar walls of my home into a stage for an unsettling drama, one that still sends shivers down my spine when I recount it. At the time, I was still living with my parents, and they traveled frequently, leaving me to fend for myself quite often, which usually provided the opportunity for peace and quiet. They had been away for a couple of weeks now, helping some of our relatives organize her wedding in a neighboring state. Our 3-story house, quite spacious, but always seemed to me insufficiently lit, was located at the end of a deserted cul-de-sac. It has always been my refuge, a place of comfort and safety. The evening began uneventfully with me settling in for a marathon of horror movies, a genre I've always had a peculiar fondness for. Perhaps it was the thrill of confronting fear within the safe confines of fiction that drew me in. Irony would have it that the very genre I indulged in for entertainment would soon frame my real-life terror. As the night deepened, a storm began to brew outside. The wind howled like a chorus of wailing spirits, and rain battered the windows with a ferocity that seemed personal. It was in this eerie symphony of nature's unrest that I first heard it, a subtle, almost imperceptible scratching sound. It seemed to come from the front door, a gentle yet persistent scraping that was oddly rhythmic. Trying to brush off the unease creeping up on me, I paused the movie and listened intently. The sound ceased, replaced by the storm's crescendo. Convincing myself it was just a tree branch swayed by the wind, I returned to my movie, the glow of the screen a comforting beacon in the darkened room. but the scratching returned, more insistent this time, as if whatever was making the sound was growing impatient. A cold knot of fear settled in my stomach. I knew then that this was no branch against the door. It was far too deliberate, too human. With a shaky hand, I grabbed a flashlight and mustered the courage to investigate. The house felt different as I moved towards the door, every shadow a potential hiding spot, every creak a warning. I peered through the peephole, but the porch light had gone out, leaving me with a view of nothing but the storm's chaotic dance. Deciding to confront my fear, I opened the door, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The porch was empty, the storm's fury the only intruder. Relief washed over me, and I was about to chalk it up to an overactive imagination when I noticed it, the bottom of the door frame marred with fresh scratches, as though someone, or something, had been trying to claw their way in. Panic surged through me, and I quickly locked the door, backing away as if the action alone could shield me from whatever lurked outside. We had a huge wine cabinet in our kitchen, or rather, it was more like a small room with a separate, rather heavy door, and I frantically headed towards locking the shutter behind me. It was the safest place I could think of. I still was hearing the storm outside. It mirrored the turmoil within me, a perfect backdrop to my growing dread. I took my cell phone out of the pocket and called my parents, seeking the comfort of their voices. No answer. As I sat there, listening to the storm's rage and the house's unsettling symphony of creaks and groans, in addition to everything else, there were sounds from the TV, where at that moment the fourth part of The Wrong Turn was playing. I realized how thin the veil of safety really is, how easily the familiar can turn foreign. The night wore on, a test of endurance between my fear and the coming dawn. And then something really creepy happened. The fact is that my room was right above the wine cabinet. I heard rustling noises a couple of meters above my head. It was very quiet, rustling noises, but nevertheless audible and surrounded by the sound of rain. At one point, they stopped for a couple of minutes, and I already thought that it was just my imagination. But then, the sound of the falling Hulk figurine, which was standing on my desk above the computer, chilled me to the bone. I realized that it was him because that on the back of the figure there was a button. When pressed, it produced a characteristic sound. It was quite heavy, and the dull sound from the fall, together with the familiar voice, scared me so much that I hid in the farthest and darkest corner of the cellar. I tried to be very quiet and even breathed so as not to hear myself. I was sitting in that position until the morning and did not sleep that night. By the way, my parents didn't respond to text messages either, I think because they had been asleep for a long time. When an early morning finally broke, the storm had passed, and the world outside seemed to reset to its usual calm. I left the wine cabinet very carefully, constantly listening to every rustle and sound outside. There was no one at home, and I quickly ran to the front door. I was surprised, but the bolt was open. Did I forget to close it, or... My thoughts were confused, but I was just glad to have the opportunity to be under the sun. So for some reason, I stood in our garden for a while. I called my parents, told them about this strange situation, and sent them a photo of the marks on the door. This time they answered me. Actually, I woke them up. They were horrified and promised to come as soon as possible, postponing all their plans. In several hours, I already entered the house with my mom and dad. I was scared to go inside alone without them. Apart from the strange scratches and a little mess, my parents didn't pay attention to anything. Another strange fact is that the bolt to the barn behind our house was also open. It was a place where my father did not allow anyone to go except him. Inside, he kept all sorts of things for repairs and woodworking. Everybody calmed down, but they didn't know one fact that I decided to keep silent about in order to save their nerves and let this whole story be forgotten. I know exactly how I always place my figure. The Hulk is next to his monitor. His head is always turned to my bed. Only now the figure was carelessly turned towards the books standing nearby. I didn't put it in that position. It was someone else. That experience left me with a profound sense of vulnerability, a realization that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones we live through, not the ones we watch on screen. The boundary between the known and the unknown, I learned, is often much closer than we think, sometimes just outside our front door. Subscribe for more scary videos and press the like button if you enjoyed.